Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I am itching to talk about propagation. All of these were propagated by cuttings, by the way, and since I've sold most of these, I have to get some cuttings for next year. I've been out to the garden, had a look at the stems on my roses, for instance, and found that they're a bit soft yet. I'll throw in some footage of that. Now what I am going to do, because the plants are clearly not ready, is I have to be ready. I'm setting up my setup for this year. Now every year I think about what is the coolest way that I could propagate plants. Not about coolest necessarily, it's about what works the best, but there is a part of my brain that goes to cool techniques. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of those techniques. Number one, I'm going to talk about bottom heat. Not just temperature, but the providing of temperature through the root zone of the plants, which actually increases your success level greatly. And there are different ways to do it. In fact, as a quick aside, my first video that I made on this entire channel was how to make a heated propagation bench. So full circle here, by the way. Next thing I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about how to provide humidity. Now you could go as simple as a humidity dome. That's what I've been talking about recently, but there are other ways to provide humidity, including timed mist, which is an advanced technique, I guess, and also ultrasonic fog, which I'm going to talk about in this video. The third thing I'm going to talk about is light. Now obviously we have sunlight, but that can be a bit harsh for young cuttings, so not too much, and I'm going to talk about some supplemental light options. And what I really want to talk about is the coolest setup that I can imagine and envision using. But if you're not an advanced hobbyist, don't worry about that, because just the discussion of what those cuttings actually want, the conditions that they want, whether you solve it with just a corner in your garden where you've stuck them into the ground and in moist soil and shade, or whether you deal with them in humidity domes or benches, whichever way you do it, the discussion of what those cuttings actually want and need is really the crux of this video. Well, these roses that are out in the garden are still definitely too bendy for our use today. I was able to go into the greenhouse and find one that was sufficiently advanced. It's still flexible, but it has a little more firmness to the stem. This is the stage that I would use for cuttings generally, and it's helpful to have that in hand because I want to ask this cutting throughout the video, what kind of conditions would you want if you wanted to root very, very quickly? And the first thing it might say is, well, prepare me by stripping off the bottom leaves, which you can see I've done here, and giving me a quick dip in a rooting hormone powder. Now that's not really the topic of this video, I'm more talking about conditions, but you may as well start the right way. So then you might ask it, well, what would you want in terms of conditions? And if you asked it about temperature, it would say, yeah, there is an ideal temperature, and that ideal temperature might be between 21 and 24 degrees Celsius. I'll put Fahrenheit up here as well, but it's not talking about that specifically as the overall or room temperature. It's actually talking about the root temperature, because if you look at a cutting like this, the thing we don't want is we don't want to see the top buds where these leaves are. There's a dormant bud there. We don't want to see those buds advance beyond the roots. The roots should be the first thing that goes, and by differentially giving it the heat from down below, you're actually encouraging the roots while not pushing those buds at the same time. So if you asked it specifically, it would say, I want warm feet, but I want cool air on my face so that I can actually give you roots faster than I give you shoots. The version of bottom heat that most people might be familiar with instantly is seedling heating mats or propagation heating mats, and these are electrical plug-in type devices that can fit underneath one tray or up to a few trays, and they either are pre-programmed to give you a certain temperature, often the temperature that's good for seeds or seed germination, which is actually a little bit higher than you need for most cutting propagation, or they have an adjustable thermostat. And for an indoor location where you're not going to get rained on, also for a small number of trays, this can be a reasonable solution. But one thing I do note about these is that those thermostatic controls are not perfect. Oftentimes I've heard feedback from people that they get a much higher temperature on their cuttings than they want to have, and they end up with some damage to the cuttings because of that. So if this would be a good time in the video or a good time in the comments for people to point out if they've had good luck with the seedling heating mats, but let's say you wanted to do a larger number of trays, or you wanted something a little more controllable. Let's think about what the professionals use, and oftentimes that is a boiler, a hot water boiler that then distributes hot water through a system of pumps and then pipes and then little tubes that go underneath the benches and distribute that water and make it flow to deliver that heat. Now there's a couple of problems with this system. It is, again, great for large scale, but it also is very expensive. It can be very prone to breakdown because of all the moving parts in it. And third of all, it's not exceptionally even in some cases. Even between those little pipes, those little distribution tubes that happen on the benches, if there's 8 inches between them, that's enough distance between them that it's delivering the heat very, very well at this point and at this point. But in between, you have plants that don't root quite as well because they're not getting access to as much heat. So those uneven results and its proneness to breakdown make the middle ground options a little more attractive. And so I've seen a lot of small growers like me use middle grounds like, oh, let's say a heating blanket, an electric blanket that I've seen used this way, where it can do a larger space. Other things I've seen is like soil heating cables, and that was what I used in my first video, with soil heating cables in a bed of sand trying to deliver that heat to the root zone. But I want to show you some other options here. Let's go look at a bench that I'm building right now. Here's my current project to try to solve the underbench heating problem. And have a look at this. What we've done is we've put a wooden frame to hold everything up. And then down here, we've restricted the air area underneath the bench top. This is the bench top up here. And we've restricted that using insulation. So now it's a smaller area that we're going to fill with heated air. Now, of course, that approach requires us to solve some problems. Like, first of all, how do the plants get the heat? And for that purpose, the top surface has to be very thin, but also quite strong. And that's what this is. It's a polycarbonate panel that is thin and strong and will actually conduct the heat. Also, the supports that are underneath that carbonate panel, the polycarbonate panel, have to be something that will not block the flow of heat, so we can get quite even heating. In this case, we've used metal studs, which will also conduct the heat quite nicely. So it's actually kind of an ideal setup here. And of course, it's hobby scale, or say mid-size grower scale, and it does have to solve some of those problems of what do we deliver the heat with. And in this case, because we're trying to deliver it using hot moving air, I'm going to look at one of those diesel cab heaters. So this is a diesel heater down here. We're going to pump the heat in there and out, and that's going to have to be controlled by thermostatic controls. To get fine control of those temperatures, I'm using a setup that's a bit like this. This is a Bluetooth adapter for my computer. That is a Bluetooth temperature and humidity sensor that will get me the temperatures. And then once the computer processes that, it will be able to send a signal through this device here that will cycle the Chinese diesel heater on and off appropriately. Now, this is a little more high-end, and obviously we haven't really worked out the kinks on it yet, but certainly once you have a bench like this with a top that can conduct the heat and a restricted area underneath to insulate and keep that heat in the air from escaping in the wrong places, you could introduce the heat down there. And I've seen it with a lot of custom setups or do-it-yourself setups that use things like, for instance, heat lamps or electrical sources, lights even, LED lights. So there's lots of ways to introduce heat down here, and we're just going with the diesel heater because it is a very efficient way to add lots of heat very quickly and supply that efficiently or cost efficiently to a small area. With the discussion on underbench heating or bottom heat out of the way, if I asked this cutting, what else would you like so that you can have a really good success rate and root very quickly, it might next mention humidity, because it wants to have a good amount of humidity around this foliage so it doesn't lose its leaves or dry out prematurely, but it does not want to have a whole bunch of standing water around itself so that it's going to either rot or it's going to have standing water on those leaves and they're going to drop off prematurely. So it wants humidity, but not too much. Ways that people have handled this in the past are things like this. This is a humidity dome. You can see it has holes in the top there. I've shared this with you in a number of videos recently as a good, and I'm going to say quite good, compromise, where you put some moisture on the plants, you have some moisture in the soil, it holds that moisture around it. When you see condensation on the inside of that bin, you kind of know it's at the right humidity level, but it does have some holes in the top for air circulation so it doesn't rot. Now, other ways that professional growers might do it, things like this, because you can fit one tray underneath it, but it does waste some space on both sides and take up a lot of bulk. and it's a lot of handling. You have to open and close that bin to handle it. It kind of becomes inefficient. So professional growers actually handle this a lot more frequently with something like timed overhead misting. They have misters that put out a fine spray of water, and they might do it, for 15 seconds every 10 minutes or something along those lines. But that is going to have to be controlled, and they have their sensors where it controls it based on how much sun you've had, how much wind you've had, how fast they're drying out. Now, a control system like that and those kinds of misters can be a little bit hard to figure out, a little bit finicky, let's say. So I actually had a look at a different one, and again, this goes out to the cool factor is I thought, what about using an ultrasonic fogger? And this might be more experimental than anything, but let's have a look at that option as well. Here's an ultrasonic fogger that you'd use in kind of like a pond application in a bin of water. And here it is fired up and blowing out some of that fog, which is kind of cool. And the idea behind this is that if I could direct it above the plants in a way that moistened them without getting those leaves all wet, that might be just about the ideal circumstance. And in fact, many growers use this in something of technique called aeroponics or aeroponic propagation. So the idea would be then to take this bin, fill it up with some water, and then use a top bin like this with a fan on this end and an output on this end to drop that fog down onto the cuttings so that they don't dry out, but they also don't get wet. Once you've locked down a favorable temperature and humidity, the very next thing this cutting might ask about is an appropriate level of light. Now you might wonder, why not just put it out in the full sun, plenty of energy, or in one of these beautiful greenhouses? And the answer that this cutting might give you is, remember, you cut it off from the main plant, so it really doesn't have any place to put all of that energy that it gathers, and that extra sunlight, that intense sunlight, can come with a couple of effects that undo the work you've already done in controlling the temperature and the humidity. It will drive up the temperature and it can drive down the humidity. So having a controlled low stress level of light is usually what growers are after. At the home propagation level, what that often means is either sticking it in a shady corner of your yard under some tree cover or some high shade, or taking it indoors where you can control the light levels much more easily. Sort of bright indirect light in a room, not against the window but sort of nearby, and that works pretty well. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can employ the use of supplemental lighting or LED lighting to try to get the appropriate level of light. What that means is that if you have it indoors and you're just not getting a bright day, or you want to add a little more oomph in those hours where it doesn't get great light, you can add some extra light to the situation without adding that extra heat and without driving down the humidity. So as regards our planned location for propagation this year, of course, this is in an area of the house or underneath the house. It has cover, so it's not going to rain on it. And it has this wide open space here facing the east and, of course, facing the north as well. So this would qualify as bright indirect light for the most part on a dull day or a cloudy day. It might be a bit dim down here, but in that case, we certainly can attach LED lights up above. I have those panels in the house right now, so I'll move them out here, and what I get, of course, these tables will be together. I'll have the humidity fog running over top of the tables. I'll also have the option of supplemental light, and this whole area in here tends to stay very temperature stable. It's in sort of indirect light. It doesn't heat up so much during the day, so it could come down to being fairly ideal propagation conditions. Well, that would just about cover it for a video on the topic of what's the ideal propagation setup. Fact is that your cuttings, what they would ask for, is not very different depending on whether you're a small scale or a large scale grower. They want controlled temperature, they want controlled humidity, they want controlled moderate light, and how you achieve that just depends on what is practical for your setup. So it might work for a very small scale grower to go with something like a humidity dome like this over top of a seedling heating mat, and that might get you exactly the conditions that you might need. If you were a full-scale grower, it probably would come down to full greenhouse setups with timed mist and sensors, with underbench heating with a boiler and water if you had to get to those large scales. For me, I'm kind of mid right now, and I'm playing around. I'm having fun with the concepts of doing an forced air heating under the bench and doing a fog over top of the bench in an area where I control the temperature and the humidity and all of that in bright indirect light. So that's what I consider the ideal setup for my stage of growth, and I'm hoping it works out. I'll show you the results, of course, through the season as we get things set up here. Should be a lot of fun. All right, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please drop them down in the comments of the video.